I knew people who had played around with eating disorders, who had flirted with them. They never ended up in a treatment center, and I did. And they're pretty okay. Do you have a sense in your observation from the people that landed in the treatment center, the people that you treat, what separates the people who where it becomes really acute and very life disruptive?
Yeah, it's so funny because as you were asking me the question, I felt a wave of sadness come over me, because at this point in my life I treat people who are not inpatient, but for most of my career thus far I have treated people who met acute criteria. So the superficial answer to your question is when a person becomes so impaired that they can't function, and yet underneath that I'd like to go to some of the patterns that I've experienced in my career is lack of support by others and high degree of shame. So in other words, I can't tell anybody about what I'm doing. It's so valuable to me. It's almost like they consider the eating disorder the Hope Diamond. It's my shield to the world, and I can't give it up. In fact, I might add that, and I can't cite the exact statistics, but about 85% of people who come into inpatient treatment are in just the contemplation stage of change, which is very early on. Without going into, a whole education of that, the first stage would be denial. I don't have it. The very next stage is contemplation, and it's kind of where you're sitting on this very uncomfortable fence, like, oh, I want to get well, but I don't want to gain weight. Or I want to get well, but I just want to purge when I get mad with my mom, or whatever that is. I just want to save it and just once a month. It's sort of like sitting on this very uncomfortable fence of ambivalence. And the statistics that I've read is that 85% of people who come into acute inpatient care are in the ambivalent or contemplative stage of change. And let me tell you, when that door slams behind them, that locked door, most people go back to the first stage of pre-contemplation, at least for a while. And that's why motivational interviewing and motivation enhancement is vital. That's part of joining with the patient. How do I build your motivation? Part of it is, let me show you that you're in a safe place. The other piece is, let's build some awareness of what you're doing.
Interesting. So what happens after contemplation?
So the next stage would be preparation. So if you were sitting on this fence with one leg in one backyard of relapse, returning to the status quo is really a much better way to word it, right? Because remember, familiarity is a very strong predictor. And the other backyard with the other leg is change. So if we change our terminology to status quo or change in lieu of relapse or disease, I think it has a little less stigma and judgment. So the next stage is preparation, unless you live in Canada, and they call that stage decision. So I have swung one leg over into the other backyard. That doesn't mean that I've always swung the status quo into the change yard. Sometimes my change leg is going to go over into the status quo, and I'm going to exit treatment. Things have gotten really scary. I've lost confidence that I can do this. It's too overwhelming. I don't believe that I can. I think if we look, and just talking for one more second about motivation and enhancement, is I love to use ruler questions and importance and confidence. So in other words, if you had a ruler of 1 to 10 or 1 to 12, how important is it for you to recover? The person will be very often 10, 11, 100. And then I'll kind of go back and say, well, why didn't you put it at a 5? And they get very confused. Because instead of me saying you should recover because it's healthier, all of a sudden, all of the specific and unique reasons about why they want to recover are spilling out. Because I'm always tired. Because it's so many fights with my family. Because I'm at doctor's appointments more than my job. Because I feel like a patient. I feel like an eating disorder. I feel like my family just sees me as one giant eating disorder behavior. And that gives me as the treater all the information I need to then try to help build more motivation. But the next piece is confidence. Typically what happens there is, well, how confident are you?
That you can change.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And the person will be like 3.
Of course.
Right? That's
if
really
you've done
scary.
It, you've never done that change before, so.
But I still have to undercut it. Why didn't you put that at a -3?
Ah.
They didn't know I was going to go on the negative side of the ruler.
Good. That's good.
Why didn't you put it at a -3? And very often you'll see the person contemplate for a while, and they'll say, well, I did give up smoking, and that was really tough. And I did learn how not to take the bait when my dad teases me. So you'll get them to really dig into things that they're proud of. And there again, I have just unlocked the treasure chest for therapists, as we think, about ways to intervene on what's important with them.
I see.
I love those.
Yes, I see that, yeah.
So after you lift the leg into the backyard, that is the change, okay? I move into what's called action. And one of the things that I would find typically happen is people with restricting eating disorders would be just in the door. I'm talking 2-3 days, and they would show up for goals group, and somebody might ask them, what stage of change are you in? And they would proudly proclaim that they were in the action stage of change because of the presence of treatment. They were restricting and maybe eating 50% of their meals and snacks, but they were in the action stage of change. As much as I want to validate that their continued presence in treatment is important and vital, it's sort of like Marsha Linehan, the dialectic, you're doing great and you need to do more. And so that's where I would sort of assert, in the action stage of change, it's my opinion that you have to be triggered and recognize the trigger and engage a skill for a different outcome, meaning change. So there is this certain amount of denial about, I didn't finish my meal, I could only eat half of it, and I don't know why, and I can't identify any skills. So to me, that's not the action stage of change. That's sort of wishful thinking. And that's hard. Look, as a therapist, I can validate things I don't condone. So in other words, to validate something just means I'm putting myself in your shoes, and I can say, that makes sense to me.
Sure.
Makes sense to me.
Sure.
Condoning is, that's okay, keep doing it. No.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to use DBT at that point. And then after action becomes more familiar than unfamiliar, here's the hard part. Guess what? You've probably gone back to what the original problem was because you've just given up your Joan of Arc shield and put it down. So you may feel more anxious, more depressed, more insecure. The original problems that the eating disorder knocked on your door and said, here, let me come help you with these. I think that's why we look at the functions, or shall I say the perceived functions. So really and truly, the eating disorder doesn't give me safety. It gives me orthostatic blood pressure, and I get dizzy, and I fall down. Falling down, take it from someone who's aging, is not ever a feeling of safety.
No.
So it often gives the opposite. And we have to stay in a lot of denial to keep the eating disorder valuable. It was really interesting. My favorite group and exercise in treatment was the relapse prevention plan, where people noted their self-sabotage behaviors, their triggers, their thoughts, their emotions, and then their reinforcers, which would be the reasons why they engaged in the eating disorder. And then, so everything's all blown up like this big red balloon, and it's like, yeah, this is what it gives me. And then the very next column is, okay, so now we're going to go to the experienced negative consequences. What did you end up getting? What are the facts?
Right.
The reinforcers represented fantasies or myths. The negative consequences right on the heels of the reinforcers were like a pin stuck in the big red balloon. And it was like, oh, and when it's done in a group, the camaraderie that day after day I saw from peers to the person who's vulnerably presenting, putting out everything, was why I love therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I recall that was by far the most impactful group
Yeah.
And it was fun. I mean, quote unquote. I mean, because, there is gallows humor to be had in this. And, you often get alerted to things about yourself and negative consequences and reinforcers through other people's experiences that they're putting up on a board. So you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I do that too, or oh yes, that too is a negative consequence I have experienced, and so it's great to be able to recognize yourself in what other people are experiencing. So you're like, oh wait, I thought it was just me,
Yeah. So when you return to the original problem, now's our chance to really ramp up therapy, in particular skill work. Because if we envision, and it's not quite this simplistic, but if we envision the eating disorder as a skill to rescue me from all of the negative consequences that I had before, but it didn't work, I'm really just put back in the position of the original problem. So I need to, at that point, ramp up therapy, ramp up skill development, if I haven't done that before, and skill use. Because I'm more susceptible to a low at that point.